And with your permission, we would like to move to the agenda proper and start the main discussions. So each presentation will be between 10 to 15 minutes. Please respect the time. And for the first intervention, I would like to give floor to our distinguished partner, Deputy Chairman of the National Council of Slovakia, Dr. Luboš Blaha. He is going to present an interesting presentation entitled Bratislava, a city of peace at the crossroads of global challenges. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much again, Mr. Grigorian, and dear ladies and gentlemen. I will start with the word peace, because, as I said before, Bratislava is a city of peace traditionally, and the new Slovak government, headed by Mr. Robert Fico, is really peaceful, and this is our main characteristic. I will start maybe with yesterday's summit in Paris, which was gathered by Mr. Macron, the French president. Probably you hear about the initiative of Mr. Fico, Prime Minister of Slovakia, who was the first in Europe who said that he's not going to send the troops to Ukraine in any way. And this was a big message even before this summit started. In this country, in Slovakia, where many liberal media, or majority of liberal medias, were trying to ridicule Mr. Fico, that it was just hoax that we need to send the troops to Ukraine. But then Mr. Macron, the French president, after the summit, confirmed that there is a plan of some countries in the European Union or NATO on a bilateral, substance, sending the troops to Ukraine. And it could be a start of Third World War. It could be a start of nuclear conflict. And this is something I cannot understand. Exactly as my colleague before said, there is no rationality in this thinking. I remember the times of Cold War. Okay, I was young, but still I read a lot of books. It was the time of ideological hatred, okay, but still enough common sense to avoid the nuclear war. Americans in the times of Reagan or Nixon, they didn't hate so much Russians, communist Russians, as today. Today they hated, they wanted to create the illusion that this is a total war, like it was the war of against fascism, the Second World War. But this is absolutely misconception. If we want to have a peace for future, and hopefully the earlier the better, we cannot see the rival or enemy or something like this, like total enemy, like somebody we need to eradicate. Of course, when the Russians see that we want to eradicate them, they will use all the means they have to stop us. It means nuclear weapons. And this is something just absolutely against rationality in common sense to enhance this kind of nuclear conflict. I don't understand the Western Europe today, don't understand. And not every politician, of course. I mean, the mainstream of the leaders of the Western Europe and especially United States. I mean, the Biden's administrative, because we see that there is a difference between Biden and Trump, and big difference, fortunately. And that's why we are just saying, Slovakia, we cannot change the world. We are too small nation. We have the 5.5 million of population of people in Slovakia. But still, we can say we are not going to send weapons to Ukraine, no more, because the former government sent it everything we had in our army. Today, we have the new government, the left-wing, patriotic government, which is going to foster peace. So no weapons to Ukraine and no troops to Ukraine. It's our philosophy. We want to have a peace settlement in Ukraine. We want to support any kind of dialogue, any kind of peace or armistice, or any kind of any political and diplomatic effort towards peace. Well, maybe I will quote there are a few Germans here, very famous European and German philosopher, Jürgen Habermas. Jürgen Habermas is one of the icons of social democracy. Before he was Marxist, today it's not so Marxist as well as I would like maybe. But still, he's saying that okay, he doesn't agree with Russian invasion to Ukraine. He said it in these terms. He said aggression, invasion, and blah blah. But still, he's saying, I see the situation very similar to Verdun in First World War. It's kind of useless killing on each side. And should we wait more years or more months and we will have maybe more thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of dead people in Ukraine or in Russia? And what's the goal of this? What's the destination? Why are we going to have the peace settlement just now, or trying to have this? And maybe the people should not be dying like today it is in Ukraine. I think this stance is very pragmatic and very right, and that's why I'm trying to say that you cannot just love Russia today, but you need to speak with Russians if you want to have a peace. In Slovakia, to be very correct, our society is divided half to half. It's almost half to half. Half of the population is very pro-American or pro-Western, I would say, or very Russophobic. And half of the population is much more friendlier towards Russia. And the government today is a reflection of this division, but still the government is much more oriented to the balance between the West and the East. That's why I'm talking about the bridge. That's why I'm talking about the dialogue here in Bratislava, the city of the peace. We don't consider Russians as enemies. They liberated us from the fascism in the Second World War. We didn't forget. We cannot forget. Our people were dying during the fascist era. And we are very proud on our Slovak national uprising in 1944. And at the time, I remember the time of Hitler times in the 30s and 40s. In some centers of Western Europe, especially in Germany at the times, the Russians and the Slavic nations were labeled like Untermenschen, like people who are not so high like the German elite. But when I'm hearing today or listening to the medias and the leaders of the Western countries, I find it very similar what they are saying about Russians. It's kind of fascist Russophobia. It's like collective punishment against all the Russians. I cannot accept this. I remember the war of United States against Iraq. It was against the international law. It was the aggression on a sovereign country, Iraq. But I don't remember that we were refusing to host the American sportsmen on kind of championships, like it is today in ice hockey championships, or we didn't, burn or cancel the American authors. Today, I see that there are attacks on Dostoevsky even, or other thinkers or authors from Russia. This is just nonsense. It's insanity, and that's why it's not about kind of loveness for Russia from my side. It's kind of pragmatism. We need to speak. We need to have a dialogue, and that's the only way we can have the peace in the end. Maybe I will try to. I don't know. I have 5 minutes. I will try to very shortly tell you about the position of Slovak government in analytical terms, because you probably know that Slovakia is very open-minded as regards the dialogue with Russians and Belarus and other countries. We are very open-minded to BRICS countries. We were talking about BRICS, and we are not going to go to China and say to the 1 billion country that, okay, we think that you should like we want. It's a nonsense. It's a nonsense. We cannot teach them about human rights. It's not our task. We need to respect them. And in analytical terms, we are in ethical base, we are communitarians. Maybe you know the philosophy of Michael Walzer and other authors from the United States who are telling about the ethical particularism. Like in China, you have Confucian culture. In Russia, you have Orthodox culture. In Arab countries, it's more or less Muslim culture. In other countries, it's maybe different culture. We need to respect each other. It's not our task to tell Chinese or Russians or Brazilians if they did their homework as regards human rights or as regards liberties and blah, blah. So we need to respect each other. I cannot imagine the world when Chinese will come to Brussels and will say, okay, we don't like your homosexual marriages. Let's change it. we will tell him, okay, it's our sovereignty. Are you crazy? But we are going to Beijing and saying them, okay, let's do it like we want. So this is something which we refuse. It's kind of communitarianism or particularism. This is our philosophy. First of all, this is our philosophy. That's why we are telling we want to have good relation on the north, on the south, on the west, on the east. The second part of our conception of world is something which we can find in the international theory as a realism, as international realism. We are not speculating about the human rights and other, big historical values when we are talking about empires and powers and the national interest. When we see the war in Ukraine, we see the clash of the interests between Americans and Russians. It's not about the good and evil. It's not about the beautiful Ukraine on one side and evil Putin, or how they say, Putler or Hitler. This is just ridiculous. We need to speak about interest. And there are the different interests between Russians and Americans. And sorry to say it very openly, it was NATO which was expanded towards Russian border. It was not Russian who are going to German border or to American border. They are not in the Mexico or not in Canada, but we are on their borders and they are trying to protect their interests. I don't think that my task is to defend their positions, but my task is to understand their positions because that's the only way to peace. This is kind of international realism. That's why we are very, very influenced by, for example, John Mersheimer or Kenneth Waltz and other authors, again, from the United States, who are very, very good scholars as regards national interest, as regards the rational thinking about the international relations and geopolitics. And if I can say the last and third point, which are very important for us, as a left-wing government, because we are left-wing government, but don't, I'm using this for left-wing very differently like it is in the West. We are not any kind progressive. We are not about this cultural left, which is very typical for Democrats in the Europe, in the America, or maybe some circles in the Brussels. Okay, that's their right, but still we are different left. We are the typical traditional left talking about social state, welfare state, workers, peasants, about their social rights. We are not talking about, homosexuals or transsexuals, toilets. This is not our issues. Let's respect that it is in different countries, but in Slovakia not. In Slovakia, we are talking about the worker. And left-wing thinking was always about the economic freedom. Economic freedom, not only from the personal side of view, but also from the national side of view. We are now the part of kind of global neoliberal empire where you have no sovereignty in economic terms. You started to be just a kind of colony in this empire, and this is something which we refuse. Okay, Slovakia needs to be part of kind of interconnections in the economy, of course, but still, maybe you know the works of Turkish economist Dani Rodrik. He is not the enemy of globalization, but he is still saying that there are other kinds of globalization than this neoliberal one, that only the multinational corporations will dictate the states what they should do. It should be the national state who should protect their population with their social policies, with their maybe protectionist measures. Okay, we should do this, because otherwise it will be the multinational corporations which will win. And maybe we will be in the end something, one communist leader told this in 1989, to the people before Velvet Revolution. He said to them, you will be the slaves in your own country. I'm not sure that if this is the situation today in Slovakia, but still it's very dangerous in many, many countries in the world where the multinational corporations are exploiting the people and the national governments are doing nothing to protect them. So this is our position. This is our position, very fair, very sovereign. You can like it or dislike it, but still, I think that we have the right for this. And that's why when we see the pressure on Mr. Fico, but also the pressure on Mr. Orban in Hungary, who is our good partner and colleague, only because we have the different opinions on some issues like it's Ukraine or maybe the issue of migration. We are very critical to illegal migration from other countries because Slovakia is a very vulnerable nation and we need to protect it. I think that we have the right for this. And I refuse this kind of imperialism from Brussels or from Washington that if you are not with us, you are against us, we are going to cancel you, we are going to make you everything bad. Even there was the article in Financial Times that the European Council wanted to punish Hungarian economy for their opinion about Ukraine, and they wanted to destruct economy of Hungary. This is something ridiculous. I don't think that this is the future for European Union, but we will maybe speak more about this in the European election. And it can be a turmoil in European Union because I see that there is a lot of new energy and wave of kind of Euro-critical thinking where people are very, very disgusted with this kind of imperialism. So in the end, I would just like to say, please talk each other. This is our message. Let's talk each other. And this is something, I don't think that this is something extremist. I really think otherwise that when we see the liberals who are quoting John Stuart Mill or John Locke, as I said before, they are suddenly saying that, okay, you can have just only one truth. You can have be only of this kind of human rights or liberal thinking. We need to say them, John Locke and John Stuart Mill would be ashamed of you because you are not liberals. You have so much totalitarian tendencies. If you are saying that hate Russians, you cannot be liberal. You cannot be open-minded man. And I hope that your memory from Bratislava after you will be back at home will be that this is the city of peace again. And we will do everything to stay it like this. Thank you very much.
Огромное спасибо. Фактически, господин
Heartfelt thank the Deputy Chairman of the National Council of Slovakia simply presented what the people of Slovakia think. The results of our symposium would be disseminated. Millions of people will hear this speech and they may think that you are an extremist. No, 85–90% of Slovakian people think this way. And Dr. Luboš Blaha is honestly and courageously, without any fear, presents what Slovakian people think. I am an Armenian and I take my hat off before these people and I admire them because they're honest, they're smart, and they have courage to tell what is the truth. Thank you very much for this. With your permission, I would ask Alexander Rar, member of the Council of the Club of Vienna Panap and chairman of the Eurasian Society from Berlin, Germany, the author of a book 2054, Putin's Code, to start the presentation.
More scientific lecture or impulse, which I will give in less than 7 minutes. The 2 years of war in Ukraine have, as you rightly said, dramatically reshaped Europe's geopolitical and geoeconomic situation. The turning point has given Europe a different face. The leading elites in the European Union want to defeat Russia, which itself is rebelling against the European order through the conflict in Ukraine. Russia, meanwhile, started also the conflict to weaken NATO and the EU, and neither side wants a compromise. It's all or nothing. An escalation seems likely. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, the West relied on two postulates. I think this is quite important to understand. This is my main thought. for understanding. Europe said it should be built out from an economic community to a political union. This was the idea after the reunification of Germany, after the demise of the Soviet Union, after the collapse of the Warsaw Pact 32 years ago. And the West said that the two supporting pillars for the future Europe must be NATO and the European Union. And this itself was, in all likelihood, a historical mistake. A historical mistake because a country like Russia, but also other countries of the OSCE were left aside. And I understand when the Russian elite from that time were saying that they understood that there seems no longer be a room in Europe for a major power like Russia with its own sphere of influence. On the contrary, the Western postulate, the second postulate, said clearly that a new Russian empire should never be allowed to emerge. I can remember that these talks were going on since '91, from the very beginning of the new times. And to achieve this, NATO and the EU began to establish alliances with the newly independent states around Russia. Russia resisted and sought reintegration with the former Soviet republics. And the Ukraine war is the result of this geopolitical rivalries and fightings on the post-Soviet space. But the Ukraine war was only one of the triggers of the major geopolitical upheavals. Change would probably be too light a term for the world upheaval that is being observed. The war in Israel carries the risk of a new conflagration in the Middle East, from which the West will not emerge victorious this time. China and the US are fighting for supremacy in Southern Asia. At the same time, Africa is being rocked by civil wars. The conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh is not over in the Caucasus, and the danger of war is also growing in Latin America. Europe will not be spared from the upheavals. We more and more start to understand, the Europeans, that we have to stand up from our comfortable chairs on which we were sitting the past 30 years, watching the world developments through the television. We are could become a center of this hurricane. The rule-based order that initially prevailed after the end of the East-West conflict has broken down. World politics is facing new power constellations, and today's conflicts are only the harbingers of the real world upheaval that is to come. Remember, 3 decades ago, the communist power bloc collapsed and the West emerged as a triumphant victor. Now a historical phase of weakness is beginning for the West itself. And the West doesn't want to understand this. But this phase of weakness is triggered by geoeconomic, not so much geopolitical too, but also geoeconomic upheavals in the global economy. The West's normative regulatory policy is falling apart, and the US is threatened with the specter of civil war if the fighting will start after the elections in the US on the 5th of November. The doom scenarios are possible, according to experts. And I fear that could be the end of the West as we know it, as the ideological West at least. The world is becoming a polycentric world order, a multipolar world order. In reality, we see the division of the world into new military and economic blocs. What could become very dangerous, but this seems to be now reality. Nobody can halt this. In addition to NATO and the European Union, new types of institutions, organizations are beginning to form in Asia. And everywhere in the world, especially the BRICS is becoming a kind of alternative to the Western order. The West is losing its influence on global South, threatening the global political position of the transatlantic community. Geoeconomically, difficult times lie ahead for the Europe. I said it already. The US is becoming less and less interested in an equal partnership and protective shield for Europe. America regards the EU as a competitor, especially in economic terms, and also in military terms. The United States will, and it doesn't matter who will win the elections in the United States, treat Europe more and more as a vassal, as countries which have to obey and fulfill America's geopolitical interests. And it's only up to now that the Europeans are starting to understand this. Of course, Putin's policy also to use energy as a pressure against Europe was some kind of shock, especially for us in Germany. But the United States will now have also a very important instrument, because Europe is fully much dependent on energy flows from the United States, as a weapon against us, against the European Union, in order to discipline us, the Europeans. Without the US, Europe will become a political dwarf on a global level. The liberal elites are now calling for Europeans to come together in the face of danger, but they are losing authority, and a reinvention of Europe now only seems realistic through a shift to the right. This we will see at the European elections in the beginning of June. The big winners of the world upheavals, from my subjective point of view, we can of course discuss it in the conference, but the big two winners are the United States and China. The US will, in the future decades, more and more dominate Europe more than ever before on all levels, and China will push Russia more and more into a junior partner role that Russia never wanted to play in Europe, but will probably have to do together with the Chinese, because the Chinese are the gateway of Russia, today at least, into the world economy. The relationship between Russia and Europe could be marked by contradictions in the future if the Europeans prepare for war with Russia. Hopefully that will not happen, but yesterday's meeting in Paris is an awful alarm signal for that. A new Iron Curtain is probably likely, hopefully not, but is today likely. But the overall world situation, the loss of old alliances, the changed power constellations in the world, the change of governments all over the planet could lead to a logical rapprochement between Europe and Russia again, because of the threat perceptions may change. That can happen sooner than we think. Initially, however, the EU and Russia will be severely weakened militarily as a result of this conflict in Ukraine. The material consumption and the war victims on the Russian and Ukrainian sides cannot be replaced. They are both awful. The spiral of a rearmament would put the economies of Europe and Russia in awful distress. That we have to see. Nobody talks about this yet. A new arms race will be a catastrophe for the European continent. So I end with a statement that, in my view, there is still time to rescue Europe and the architecture, the political and economic architecture of Europe, and find ways together to search for a common European space, for commonalities inside Europe. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Спасибо огромное. Перед тем, как я буду попросить леди Кэролайн Кокс сказать свое слово выступления, я хочу поблагодарить господина...
Before I ask Baroness Cox to take the floor, I would like to thank the Vice Speaker of the Slovakian Parliament. He is now responsible for everything, and he has to run to the Parliament, because there is going to be an important voting in the Parliament, which will determine many things, probably the destiny of Slovakia as well. So, with your permission, I would like to express my gratitude for brilliant presentation first, and secondly, you have shown us the orientation, the direction in which Europe should move nowadays. We will be discussing all your thoughts today and tomorrow, and probably we will also get to that point. Thank you very much.
Сейчас я попрошу баронесса Кэролайн Кокс-Квимберийская, член и бывший вице-спикер Палаты лордов Великобритания, социолог и известная защитница прав человека Великобритания. Please, Lady Cox. Switch on, please.
The floor is yours, Baroness.
So I don't idea what you kindly said about me. I hope it was kind, but I'd like to begin, if I may, this is my presentation now, by introducing myself, that I always say I'm actually a nurse and a social scientist by intention and a baroness by astonishment. I was not into politics. I was appointed to the House of Lords, which is how you become a baroness, and the House of Lords is like a Senate or an upper house in other parliaments. And that is where I now speak, and I try to speak for people suffering oppression and persecution. But if this is my presentation, I think there is a PowerPoint, which you were kindly going to show, because I'd like to speak with pictures in addition to words. So it's possible to show the PowerPoint. I think it would be very, very helpful. And just while I'm preparing the PowerPoint, my emphasis in my presentation is going to be on the situation in Armenia and the ethnic cleansing of Armenians from the little historic land of Nagorno-Karabakh. But I also work in other countries with people suffering from torture and maltreatment and abuse and ethnic cleansing, including Nigeria and Sudan and parts of Myanmar, the Shan and Kachin states, and so on. So, but today I'm going to be focusing on Armenia and the little historic land of Nagorno-Karabakh. And that is where it is located. And it was located there by Stalin inside Azerbaijan, but it is historically Armenian. For centuries, Armenians have lived there. And there are some of the oldest churches and Christian monuments in the world in that little enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh, but forcibly relocated by Stalin inside Azerbaijan. Next slide, please. And my theme is going to be contemporary ethnic cleansing. And the theme, as I say, is the displacement of Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh. And I say I could speak about other countries, but I've only got 10 minutes or so I'm going to focus. And to people for whom I have enormous respect. I've had the privilege of visiting Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh since the war in the 1990s. And I've been there, so I'm told, by the Armenian people over 80 times. I don't count, but I'm told that is so. And I have a great respect and great admiration for the dignity and the courage of the Armenian people, and in this case, the Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh. Next slide, please. Thank you. You may know that Armenia suffered the first major genocide of the last century, and Western Armenia was annexed then by Turkey. And as I've already mentioned, Nagorno-Karabakh is an Armenian enclave relocated by Stalin in Azerbaijan. But Azerbaijan began that attempted ethnic cleansing in a bitter war from 1990 to 1994. And I was there many times in that bitter war. Next slide, please. And just if anyone's interested, a colleague wrote a very detailed analysis which does justify the use of the phrase ethnic cleansing. And just some of the photographs in that publication, there is the bombing of Stepanakert, I mean, an annihilation of the little capital city, the use of cluster bombs, which is against international law, and the heartbreaking displacement of thousands of Armenians from their homes in that little historic homeland. Next slide, please. And renewed offenses by Azerbaijan. More recently, Azerbaijan has perpetrated more offenses against the Armenian civilians in Nagorno-Karabakh, with destruction of buildings of historic and cultural significance and attacks on civilians, forcing a mass exodus fleeing from the little land of Nagorno-Karabakh, where their homes or their farms, their homeland, whatever it is, only able to take with them those things that they could carry with them. Next slide, please. But that 44-day war resulted in Azerbaijan's occupation. It is way back in just relative recent in 2020, Azerbaijan's occupation of 80% of Nagorno-Karabakh. I've taken some of these pictures. These are pictures of the destruction caused by Azerbaijan bombardment on civilian targets, which is a war crime. Next slide, please. We have another slide, I hope. I hope it's another slide. Oh, thank you. Yes. And then Azerbaijan troops here are seen celebrating the capture of the town of Jabrayil, and it's taken from the tower of a local church. Azerbaijan has a very disturbing tendency to target spiritual and cultural targets. And this church was one of the ones that had been taken by them. It's a photograph taken actually by the BBC at that time. Next slide, please. And I'm afraid that's all that's left of the church. Complete destruction. And if you go, there's a large area called Nakhchivan that is between Azerbaijan and Turkey. It's a large area. It's historically Armenian, and it had many historic Armenian churches and shrines there. If you fly over Nakhchivan now, that's what you see. You don't just see buildings that are damaged, you see the complete annihilation, the complete destruction of places of spiritual and cultural heritage. And that destruction of that church is one example, but that's a relatively recent example in Nagorno-Karabakh. Next slide, please. Now, HEART, my little not-for-profit organization, has been able to support a rehabilitation center in Nagorno-Karabakh. The founder, Baden Tebosian, developed that center. It became internationally renowned as a center of excellence. And it was this year, it's the 25th anniversary. So they called it after me, I don't quite know why, the Lady Cox Rehabilitation Center. But it was too dangerous for us to stay in Nagorno-Karabakh. So Vardan, the director, had to say he had to leave. He said, we are heartbroken. After 25 years of hope and healing, we had no choice but to evacuate the center. So amongst the huge displacement of virtually all the Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh, 100,000 of them, just a little handful have remained. Vardan had to leave Nagorno-Karabakh, and that historic and internationally renowned rehabilitation center. Remember last time I was there, I saw someone from Japan walking out. It was visited by people from Japan, from Africa, internationally renowned. But as he said, heartbroken because they had to leave that rehabilitation center behind in Nagorno-Karabakh when they were forced to leave. Next slide, please. That is a picture of the rehabilitation center as it was, and a wonderful team of nurse specialists and physiotherapists and so on. It was internationally known. Next slide, please. But more recently, there's been a 9-month blockade of the Lachin corridor. The Lachin corridor is the only real road linking Armenia with Nagorno-Karabakh, which was used for the transport of medical supplies or patients. It's the main road. Now, that was blocked by Azerbaijan for 9 months. And then for 271 days, the 120,000 ethnic Armenians who lived in Nagorno-Karabakh were denied access to essential goods and services. It was horrific, because last year, residents fainted in the streets from hunger, 90% of pregnant women became unwell with anemia, miscarriages increased due to high levels of stress and a lack of access to vital medication. More than 2,000 babies were deprived of baby food, and as I mentioned earlier, the people were eventually forced to flee from their homeland by the main access to Armenia through the Lachin corridor. And I was there as they were coming through. Next slide, please. At least 100,000 civilians had to flee, only taking what they could carry with them. And Armenia was subjected to severe problems, having to receive this massive influx of refugees. Armenia is not a big and a particularly wealthy country. And the mass exodus the Armenians forced to flee from their homes and their homeland is, I would argue, a contemporary example of ethnic cleansing. I think that may be the end of my presentation. I know time is of the essence, as it is. So I've used up my time, but I'm happy to take any questions or deal with any criticisms or comments you may have. But a short time, but I tried to put over as clearly as I could what I see as the ethnic cleansing of the Armenians from a very historic homeland of Nagorno-Karabakh. which lies in Azerbaijan control, and only just a handful of Armenians left there, and they're treated a bit like prisoners in the capital city, Stepanakert. Okay, I've managed to go through the pain and the passion of telling you the passion and suffering I feel for the Armenians there, but I'm happy to take any questions or comments you might like to put to me. Thank you. Большое спасибо. I'm going to use my timer.
Thank you very much, Lady Cox. За 10 минут
Thank you so much, Lady Cox.
Lady Caroline Cox, вы могли за 10 минут
Lady Cox, within 10 minutes of time, you managed to convey to the world and to Europe something that Europe was failing to understand in the last 18 months. Moreover, in 2005, in 2006, more than 10 during decades, in front of the eyes of the entire world, Nakhichevan cultural monuments were being destroyed
Yep.
by Azerbaijan. Myself, as a chairperson of the Armenian diasporas in Europe, I addressed and I wrote many times to Irina Bokova, the head of UNESCO. And back then, we noticed that corruption was ongoing in UNESCO, and we drew the world's attention to this fact. And Irina Bokova, the Bulgarian chairperson of UNESCO, was dismissed. What Lady Cox was doing for the sake of justice can only be compared with the work and life of Mother Teresa. In 20th century, we had Mother Teresa, and in 21st century, we have Lady Cox. Enormous thanks to you, Baroness. You deserve long and flamboyant words of gratitude. But I think that all the next speakers, and by the way, we are recording this symposium in Russian and in English, and I think all the audiences that will be listening to your presentation, they should remember well that the world's justice and kindness is based on people like Baroness Cox. The more people like her we have in the world, the more promising the world's future is, and the more we will avoid Third World War. With your permission, there's a question from Karina Gevorkian from Moscow.
Just before the question, can I just make one comment of the words
Вопрос заключается в следующем. По отношению...
The real heroes and heroines are those on the front lines of faith and freedom, not me, but the Armenians on the front lines of faith and freedom, and in other countries too, like Nigeria. They're the real heroes and heroines, and it's our privilege to be with them. Thank you.
Спасибо, мы, конечно, абсолютно согласны с вами.
Thank you so much, and we absolutely agree with you.
Thank you. Was there a question which I interrupted?
Yes, there's a question, and I appreciate your presentation very much, Baroness Cox, and here is my question to you. The practice of ethnic cleansing that you so brilliantly described is, as far as I understand, at the moment being conducted towards Palestinians. I'm not now thinking in the categories of who is good, who is bad. I just see that there's a practice of blockade there, the limitation of population's possibilities and opportunities. Well, this is what is happening there, and there are no international mechanisms and interstate mechanisms to stop this practice. So Karabakh is not the only phenomenon in the world. We have so many other examples, unfortunately. Tell me, please, with your political and public experience, Baroness, do you think we should establish the relevant institutions that could stop this kind of inhuman practices? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I agree completely with what you said. about the influence of the blockade. And I agree passionately with the suggestion of the need for an institution to address these issues, to protect the vulnerable, the ones who are being left to die. We see it happen. We see young people dying of starvation and so on, to protect the victims, and above all, perhaps alongside that, to protect the fundamental front lines of freedom. And so my answer is a big yes. Love to work together with on that. Thank you.
Спасибо огромное, Леди Кокс.
Thank you so much, Baroness Cox. It has been a great privilege for us to listen to your words. Thank you very much indeed.
And may I thank you very much indeed. It's been a privilege to be with you. And I'm very, very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.